pretty consistent. Okay, so again, we are at Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the 10 virgins, and then the parable of the talents we're going to look at, because both of these parables have to do with how to best live our lives as we await for Jesus's return. You know, in our day and age, we understand the idea that at some point Jesus is going to return, but because it's been, 2,000 years, most of us probably, to be honest, if it happens during our lifetime, that would be awesome. But none of us would probably bet that it will happen in our lifetime. The first followers of Jesus, they really, really believed it was going to happen, right away. Now, what's interesting here is Jesus tells these stories, but he hasn't left for the first time. So I'm not quite sure how they understood the whole second coming, or the coming of the Son of God. Well, aren't you here? What does this all mean? And I don't know that they probably, as they heard this, I'm sure after his ascension and the start of the church and the day of Pentecost, I'm sure they were recollecting, you remember when Jesus told those parables? So that's what he was talking about, huh? I don't know how much they would have caught at this point, in understanding that, okay, this guy that's telling these stories is the Messiah. He's going to usher in a kingdom that is more spiritual than physical. He is not going to overthrow Rome, but he is going to overthrow Satan and sin and death. And he's going to leave us, and he's going to want us to tell everybody about him. And then he's going to come back, and he's going to kind of lead us to think he's coming back soon, and it's imminent, but soon is relative for him, and it might not be for thousands of years before he comes back. So I don't know that they got all of that, maybe quite the way we understand it a little bit, but anyway, that's kind of what, the idea here is to be prepared and to be ready for the coming of Jesus. And so let's begin at, we'll read through the first parable, which is the first 13 verses, and it's known as the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The 5 who were foolish didn't take enough oil for their lamps, but the other 5 were wise enough to take along extra oil. When the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, they were roused by the shout, "Look, the bridegroom is coming. Come out and meet him." And all the bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. Then the 5 foolish ones asked the others, "Please give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out." But the others replied, "We don't have enough for all of us. Go to a shop and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the bridegroom came. Then those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was locked. Later, when the other 5 bridesmaids returned, they stood outside calling, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he called back, "Believe me, I don't know you. So you too must keep watch, for you do not know the hour or day of my return." Okay, when you first read, at least, and admittedly, when I was looking at this yesterday, and it's been some time since maybe I've looked at this parable, prior to yesterday and prior to preparing to teach this tonight, it's kind of like, okay, what's going on here? Who are these 10 bridesmaids, and why are bridesmaids going to see a bridegroom, and what is this all about? And this sounds really kind of unfamiliar to at least it did to me. And so, I had to remind myself as I was reading and studying, preparing for this, had to just kind of remind myself of the culture that this is based in, because this story is kind of more based in some cultural practices of that day and age that maybe, that certainly aren't familiar to us. We can understand the next parable of a man who gave money and entrusted money. We get that. This one is a little more tied into the culture of that day to really understand what it was that Jesus is trying to teach us here. Again, you don't want to make too much out of all of the parables. They are just hypothetical stories, made up fiction, so would this happen in real practical life? Likely not, but here is kind of a cultural explanation, and that'll help us to understand a little better what Jesus is trying to get at. So there were 3 stages to the Jewish wedding in that day. The first was what was known as engagement, and that was when the 2 families, particularly the fathers of these families, would enter into a formal business agreement that your son is going to marry my daughter. Love relationships weren't, the norm there, and these were, arrangements, of course, by the fathers. So once the parents got together and the fathers made this agreement, then the next stage would be what would be known as the betrothal ceremony, and that would be where they would make promises to one another. It wouldn't be marriage, but this would, kind of firm up that now the couple is betrothed to each other, that this has gone beyond a family agreement, and this has now become the couple's agreement as well. Not that they had a whole lot of choice, but this would take things up a notch. And this is where Mary and Joseph were at when it was announced to her that she was pregnant. This isn't in their culture. Betrothal is not the time when you live together. It would be more of what we would understand as engagement. Of course, in today's day and age, they live together before they're ever engaged anyway. But in that culture, the marriage was not consummated until the 3rd stage, and that was, the wedding feast, the actual wedding, which would normally be about a year after the betrothal stage, and then that would be when the bridegroom would come for his bride, and that's when in around that range, that would be when they would have another kind of commitment ceremony. They would consummate the marriage, and then they would party for about 5 days. And so that was kind of the stage that took place with these bride, with these weddings. So now when the time came for the actual wedding, and we're in Matthew 25, when the time came for the actual wedding, it would be traditional that the bridesmaids, these would be 10 relations of the bride, friends, cousins, could be anybody. They would traditionally, when the bridegroom was arriving, and for some reason this would be done at night, that they would go out, the bridesmaids would go out, and they would guide the groom the rest of the way to the bride's home, and they would lead him. It was sort of like this formal parade that would lead this procession to the house and to his bride. There are a lot of cultures that have really, really unique wedding traditions, things that we would not, know about or understand the deeper meanings. But this was one of those cultural things that they did. So it was not unusual to see, 10 ladies with lamps parading the groom that last, kilometer or two as he came for his bride at the end of the year. And there are different thoughts on why the number was 10, but that was the normal processional. So this story, while culturally it doesn't connect with us, it most definitely would have connected with them. They would not have been like, okay, what in the world is he talking about here? They would have understood, the culture of this. Now, Jesus, as he tells the story, he kind of he separates these 10 bridesmaids into two groups. One group he labels foolish, and the other group he labels wise. And if you think back to, let's say, the parable, or when Jesus was talking about the two builders, and there was a foolish builder because he built his house on the sand, which represented the man who heard the word and didn't put it in action, and there was the wise builder, who put his words into action. So again, you hear, this idea, the separation of that who is, the foolish and the wise. And now, when you look at this story, you're going to ask yourself, well, what was the basic difference between the foolish ladies and the wise ladies? And of course, the obvious answer is the foolish ladies didn't take enough oil to get them through the night, and the wise ladies did. And that's the obvious answer. But the more pointed answer would be that the wise ladies, they understood a couple of things. They understood that there was no real definitive time for the bridegroom to appear. They might have got out there early evening and thinking, okay, he should be here soon. Well, he doesn't show up for quite some time. And there's this delay between the time when they expected him to come and the time that he would actually arrive. And so this group of wise ladies, they understood, number one, there is no definitive time. We don't know when the bridegroom is going to come. And number two, we need to be prepared, whether it's whether it's an early arrival, an on-time arrival, or a delayed arrival, or in the case of the parable of the mad traveler, a canceled arrival. Inside joke, you weren't here. But, so the thing is you got to be prepared for no matter when the bridegroom arrives. It was the duty of the bridesmaids to be ready for his arrival and to accompany him in sort of a parade or a procession, on the remainder of the journey to the home of the bride. And so that was really the difference between this group of wise women and this group of what Jesus refers to as foolish. And the difference was in that one was prepared and one was not. One understood the only thing certain is uncertainty. There's nothing certain except uncertainty. And so you've got to be ready no matter when it happens. You've got to prepare yourself. And this other group did not prepare themselves. So were these, and you can see the parallels of how this applies to, again, remember both of these parables we're going to look at today deal with how we are to live in light of and regarding the expected return of Jesus. And certainly we need to live understanding that you don't know when it's going to happen. You never can predict it. Early, on time, late, you just have to be ready and you have to be prepared to receive the bridegroom when he returns. And so this is, again, just the importance of being prepared and understanding that there's no certain definitive time that this is going to take place. So when they first noted that the bridegroom was coming, was it at a time where they were now expecting it? Well, they were asleep. In fact, it was around midnight, so all of them had kind of dozed off a little bit as they were waiting, and then somebody, if it wasn't one of these 10, it might have been somebody else, but somebody was, noticed that the bridegroom and maybe his entourage. He probably, it would have been safe to travel alone, especially at midnight. And again, would a bridegroom really show up at midnight? It might happen, but again, this is a hypothetical story. Jesus is making the story work to prove a point. Okay, so these 10 ladies are all asleep, and then the bridegroom is spotted on his approach. So while both the wise and the foolish bridesmaids slept, when the arrival of the bridegroom was announced, the wise ones were prepared to act immediately. Even though they were unexpectedly awakened, they were prepared to act immediately because they had enough oil to get them on the trip from wherever they connected with the bridegroom to the bride's house. Where the foolish ones, they were not prepared because they must have said, well, we don't need to bring that much oil because, it's not like he's going to get here at midnight. We'll get there. He'll be here by 7 or 8. We still have another 3-4 hours of oil back. It's only a 2-hour trip back. We're good. They didn't consider the point that there will be some reason for why the bridegroom has not returned as quickly as they were anticipating him to return. And isn't that, again, just like the way we should be thinking? You think about the end of 1 Peter chapter 5, I think it was, or no, it was 2 Peter chapter 3, my bad, where, Peter expresses, well, I know some of you think the Lord is slow in returning and doing what he was going to do, but the Lord is not slow. He's actually patient. There's a difference between, being slow and being patient. Being late often is just because you're running late because you didn't prepare right. Being patient is you got a thought out plan here. And so God is being patient. So we can see the parallels, are really, really obvious, here in how we are to think through and approach what we expect, Jesus's return. Now, so these 5 ladies, they don't have enough oil for the return trip home, and their lights would go out. Well, they probably could still see from the lights of the other 5 bridesmaids. That probably wasn't a problem. Here was the issue. For this to happen would bring great shame upon the bride and her family, because her parents and her, they did a poor job in selecting the bridesmaids. They selected people who were not responsible enough for this job. They were not responsible enough for this. And so you may think, okay, so the 5, but no, it would, again, cultural in that day, cultural respects and procedures and happenings were very, very critical in many, many cultures. Many cultures. I could recall when I first brought Susie home to my New York Italian family, there were certain things that we just did because that's what we did and we always did and we understood that. And my wife had no clue about any of that. And my parents couldn't understand what was wrong with her that she didn't do that. Well, Dad, do you realize people outside of Italian New York cultures don't do these things? Like, for example, New Yorkers, when we greet each other, we almost always just give a kiss on the cheek. You go side to side, guy goes to the left, because if you both go to the left, you end up accidentally kissing around the lips. So, we just kind of, you kind of put your cheek to cheek and you kind of kiss sound, and that was just what people would do when they'd walk in. Well, my wife never did that. She was very uncomfortable with that. My parents at first thought my wife was kind of rude because she didn't, why wouldn't she come in and kiss me? Well, they don't do that in their culture, So there's a lot of cultural things that, in some cultures that very, very important to them. And if you don't do that, they see it as a great offense, and they take it, as a great offense. And so in this culture, for a groom to be escorted by only 5 lights would be a kind of cultural taboo, in this culture. And so that's why this was a, as Jesus would tell this story, they listen would be like, what? They didn't do the honorable thing. This ruins the whole wedding, even though we'd be like, okay, what's the big deal? It's just symbolic. But again, in many cultures, symbolism is a lot. It's very meaningful. Symbolism is very, very meaningful to a lot of cultures. So now what's interesting here, I think when they ask, and I don't know that there's anything we're supposed to pull out of this, but when the foolish ones asked the wise ladies if they could have some of their oil, because they recognized the problem, the others were not generous to give. But then there may have been a reason, because if you look at verse 9, it says, and the others replied, we don't have enough oil for all of us. And again, that might be like, well, listen, we don't have enough for you. Go to a store and go buy some. Or it could be, listen, we'd love to help you out, but we just don't have enough. So where a part of the wisdom of these other ladies is they not only made sure they brought it up, but they knew what they had. They knew what their resources were. They maybe didn't bring enough to account for the foolish ladies who didn't bring enough, but they knew they had enough to get them through the night. And that was the most important thing, because once the light goes up, this is all done in the evening in their culture. So, it's interesting, until the moment comes, there really was no apparent difference between the wise and the foolish, is there? Now, the thing that reveals who was wise and who was foolish is the crisis itself. It's the crisis itself. That's when, the divide became apparent. And you know what? Again, that's a lesson in and of itself for the end times, and for the return of Jesus. There will be many, many, many who, will not think there's any difference between the saved and the unsaved. There are many people out there who are not in any way, shape, or form, followers of Jesus, so in any real way, but they believe that when they die, the universe will be good to them and they'll live on in some shape or way or form, and it might not be until the return of Jesus that a lot of these people realize they were not ready and they were not prepared for his return, because this is all about being prepared for the return. And sometimes it's the crises that we face that really are the telltale signs of who is ready and who is not ready for the coming of Jesus. And that was seen here. Okay. Now, they're told to go to a shop and buy some for yourselves. I don't know if there were any 24-hour oil stores in, to go to the local Walmart. I don't know. I would imagine that would be a probably difficult thing to go do. But in this story, I guess they did, because they eventually do return at some point. So while all this was going on, at least in this story, they do find a way to go and buy the oil. And while they are gone doing something else, this is when the bridegroom arrives. And by the time these other 5 get back with the oil, well, the marriage feast had already begun. And once, and I don't know if this part is cultural, it may not be. Once the marriage feast began and the door was locked, nobody else could come in. And can you see the parallel there? That, listen, once, when we either pass or Jesus, or if we're alive when Jesus returns, that's the end. there's no more chances. There's no more time. And exactly, the Ark of Noah's time. Yep, that's an exact, once the door was shut, that was it. And the rains came, and people wanted to get in at that point, but there was no way in at that point. So they're begging, to gain entrance into the home. But then we might see that the bridegroom is a little terse with them in his response in verse 12. Said, believe me, I don't know you. At this point, I don't know you. And that, kind of reminds us of those chilling words of Jesus in Matthew 7, that not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Or, what Jesus says in Matthew 25, depart from me, I never knew you. The truth is, many people who fully expect to enter heaven are going to be very sadly disappointed, when they realize they were not properly prepared for the return of the bridegroom, and as a result, they're not welcomed in. And the sad thing is, by the time they realize it, it'll be too late, So the point of this parable is really to be properly prepared. That we need to be ready at all times for the return of Jesus. We don't know when that's going to happen, but we need to be prepared, because those who do not prepare properly, they will be left out at the end. Now, the next parable that Jesus tells, and part of why we're taking these together, is the much more familiar one, the story of the parable of the talents. And Jesus tells this story to demonstrate what does it mean to be prepared. Okay. See, the parable of the 10 virgins was all about, you need to be prepared. You need to be ready. Well, then the question may come up, okay, he tells this story, we need to be prepared. How are we supposed to be prepared? What are we supposed to do to be ready? And that's kind of what the next parable is. So we'll pick up from verse 14 and read the more familiar parable of the talents. Again, the kingdom of heaven, and we're at Matthew 25:14. The kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants, and he entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver, or your Bible might say, he gave 5 talents to one, 2 bags of silver or talents to another, 1 bag of silver or talent to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. He then left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with the 2 went to work and earned 2 more, but the servant who received 1 dug a hole in the ground and he hid the master's money. Well, after a long time, their master returned from his trip, and he called them to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he'd entrusted 5 talents or bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 talents to invest. I've earned 5 more. The master was full of praise. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling the small amount. So now I'll celebrate. I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. The servant who had received the 2 came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 to invest, and I have earned 2 more. Master says the same thing to him. Verse 24. Then the servant with the 1 bag of silver to 1 talent says, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you don't cultivate. I was afraid I'd lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here's your money back. The master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I would have gotten some interest on it. And then he ordered, take the money from this servant and give it to the one with the 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given. and they'll have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even with what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right. Now, the practice, the idea here of a landowner entrusting his finances to his servants was not all that uncommon in that culture. Again, the banking system wasn't quite as developed as it is in our culture. We might not think, that this would be a wise way to handle, and a talent, the amount of money here was not insignificant. It wasn't like, okay, you're getting $50, you're getting $20, and you're getting $1 or $10. I mean, this was a significant amount of money in this culture. And so again, Jesus is really trying to now address, okay, what does it mean to be ready and be prepared? How do we get ready? How do we prepare for Jesus's coming? And this parable what would it say to us? What would it say to us about being prepared and being ready for Jesus's coming? It would say, one way Jesus might define being prepared is by being a good steward and by investing the things that God entrusts you with in a way that will honor him and be according to his will. That God has proportioned each of us, and he expects us to do something significant, whether we're talking about our money, our time, our ability, our authority. Any of these things could be understood by representative of the money that these guys were each given. So often it was a safe and smart thing that a man could do with his money. Would be, I'm going to be gone for a long time, and a lengthy time might be a year to 2 years. Maybe this is a long trip. Travel in those days was obviously very, very slow. If you could walk 18 miles, 15 to 18 miles a day, like if we had a 500-mile trip, we'd get in a car at 8 in the morning and we'd be there by 6 in the evening. 500 miles by foot would take about 30 days. So it's slow. So this guy was gone for quite some time. So it's not unusual for them to, okay, you're going to take care of this. Now, obviously the servants understood, they all understood this money was not theirs. They were not given this money, because every one of them says, well, you gave me 5 bags, you gave me 2, you gave me 1. This is how I handled yours. So they all understood that this was an entrustment stewardship issue, which of course is something that, when I teach on stewardship, you really want to emphasize in that, we are not owners, we are managers, of everything that we have and everything that God has given us. It's never about us, what we own. It's about what we manage. And so the servants were given different amounts of money. And the story here in verse 15, it says they were the money was divided up in proportion to their abilities. Okay. Who got to determine what their abilities were and what that merited? The master did. That was the master who got to decide that. So even though it was given according to their abilities, but it was given by the discretion of the owner, the one who owned it. And again, that would speak to us in that whatever God has given us, he is entrusting it to you. It is his prerogative. So if God entrusts more to one person and less to another person, that is God's prerogative. God gets to do that if that's what he chooses. Whether we're talking about, literal talents like skills and abilities, whether we're talking about, money, we're talking about whatever. If God has the sovereignty to determine, and he has the discretion to determine who gets what blessings. And it's ours to do. Ours is not to worry about why we didn't get what the next person got. Ours is to do and be good and faithful with what God has entrusted us with, and that's something that I think, we have to remind ourselves, and I know I have to remind myself every day. I can't fret over what someone else has. I have to be faithful with what God has given me. And whether we're talking about the size of a church, whether we're talking about the size of a bank account, I remember I had a good friend of mine back on Long Island who was a minister of a church, and it wasn't a Christian church, but it was an evangelical church. And we'd go to county ministers meetings, and my friend Nick, whenever he led the worship at our county minister meeting, I never enjoyed the experience of worship more than when Nick led it. He just had a way about him to lead worship that for me just did it. I mean, this was like, okay, every worship leader should do it this way. This was amazing. So one Sunday I had a Sunday off from church, and so we weren't going anywhere until Susan says, I want to go to Nick's church Sunday. So we go there, and it was the church, because he was such a good musician. Good musicians attract good musicians. So this church had a lot of good musicians, and so their worship was incredible. It wasn't a super large church, but it was a great time of worship. And then it was funny. So just as he's getting ready, now he's going to preach, and so the screen there was a screen in the center. They didn't have multiple, one screen over the center, and that screen they had go up after the worship. And it was funny because they had the stained glass window behind him that faced toward the east. And so it was like when that screen went up, it was like, oh, the Shekinah glory of God just came upon, And then he started preaching, and it was this amazing sermon, just this incredible killer sermon. And I'm like, darn, I was at least hoping he couldn't preach good. I mean, he could lead worship so well, and the guy could preach so well too. That's not fair, How do you get both of these talents? And how many times I had wished, man, it would be so beneficial if I had some music ability, because there's more things I could have done, and, so, we could always look at what somebody else is given and say, oh, man, if I only had what they have, if I was only in their situation. Well, you know what? You can't concern yourself with those things. I mean, right now, I have to be faithful to this, to the 12 of you that are watching this. I have to be good and faithful in teaching this study, whether there's 12 of you or there was 35 of you. One thing I've said, I've never, ever prepared less just because I thought there was going to be a smaller group there. You know what? You're to be good and faithful with what you have, and not focus on maybe what somebody else has, because God is the one who gets to determine what you're going to be given. And, the one servant who got the one talent, we shouldn't see that as an insignificant amount. I didn't do, the calculations, but I know one talent or a bag. So it was still a significant amount of money for that culture. It wasn't just pocket change. And so though some received more, everyone received something significant, and everyone received a large amount, and were responsible for what they were given. So, so as the story goes, the master gave as he saw fit. So Two of them did the right thing with what they were given. They invested it in some way, and they were able to double their money. Wouldn't you like to know what they invested in? Wouldn't you like to double your money? And so they were wise, and they were able to double the money, and they brought back. They had the integrity enough to bring back the entire amount. My guess is, if the first one would have said, "Master, you gave me 5 bags and I've turned it into 8," and he just kind of hid and pocketed the other 2, maybe he would have got caught eventually. Most white collar crimes and stealing is eventually caught, but he was faithful and he returned it all. Same thing with the other guy. If the other guy said, "You gave me 2 and I'm returning you 3. I got 50% of your money," I would have taken that. So that's good. But so these guys showed the integrity to bring it all back. But the third guy, it wasn't that he didn't get the returns that the first 2 guys got. It was that he did nothing, just did nothing with what he was given. He could have even put it in some type of bank and gotten some type of interest. Even if he would have only got 1% interest, it would have been something. But he did nothing, with what God gave him. And so he is the one that, the guy that did nothing is the 5 foolish bridesmaids. Okay. The guy that did nothing, he's the 5 foolish bridesmaids. The 2 that did something, they're the wise bridesmaids. Because again, the parable of the talents is simply to answer for us, what does it mean to be wise and foolish? What does it mean to be ready or not ready, to be prepared or not be prepared? How is God going to determine that? And a big way he's going to determine that is based on what we do with what God gives us, and how responsible we are. Now, verse 19 is, I'm going to point something out there in verse 19, that it was after a long time. So again, you see the delay. It's a long time here in the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. It was a long time, at least relative to when they thought he was going to come. If you are expecting someone to arrive at 7 and they don't show up to midnight, that's a long time. So again, Jesus, knowing that his second coming will be near in relative to how long humanity and history exists, but in our minds, it's going to seem like a long time. And so the long delay might tempt these servants to think, well, you know what? He ain't never coming back. I'm just going to go do what I want to do with this. But they remain faithful to the end. And that's a big part of these parables, that we've seen that theme weaving through the parables, is that you need to be faithful to the end. And it's tempting. It's tempting to say, you know what? They ain't coming back anytime soon. Let me just do this, and then I'll have enough time to seek forgiveness and grace, in some way. So, the idea was, even though it's longer than you expect it to be, he's going to return. It is going to happen. And you need to be prepared. And you're prepared by properly investing the things that I entrust you with, and doing the things that I have directed you to do. So I like these words where, good and faithful servant. God is looking for goodness. God is looking for, faithfulness. And, the idea, of course, is that, those who are good and faithful, they are invited into this celebration. Again, that's the 5 wise bridesmaids who went into the house before the door was locked. The other, I guess this kind of maybe even builds on what happens to those who aren't ready and faithful. In the first story, they're just kind of locked out. But this parable takes it even further, because this person, the last comment, verse 30 of this parable, you throw this useless servant into the outer darkness, and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So it's no longer, they're just got locked out. Because, again, if you just get locked out, you might not be in, but you're at least close enough to kind of get the glare of the party, to kind of like, okay, I'm not in, but at least I'm on the edge. We still got some light, Here, Jesus tells these ones that you take them to the outer darkness. I mean, beyond the radius of the light of the celebration. You take them beyond that, so, a little bit harsh, but now here's another thing that I think is important to understand before we finish up today, is that when the master judges in both of these stories, the master judges in the first story, he kind of judges them as a group. Here, it's more individual. And, if they would have taken as a group, the 3 of them would have said, okay, boss, you gave us 8 bags of silver and we got 15 for you. He would have said, okay, not bad. This is good. But he doesn't. Everybody is judged on an individual basis, in this story. And Charles Spurgeon, of course, the great British preacher of the 19th century. I want to read you quotes a little in Old English, but I thought it's good. He said this about this parable: remember, my hearer, that in the day of judgment, thy account must be personal. God will not ask you what your church did. He will ask you what you did yourself. And so, this wasn't a collective judging. This was an individual, judging. And this third servant, he thought that the master would be pleased that he didn't lose any of it. So he chose to do nothing. He chose to just bury his talent and try to excuse his inaction by saying, well, listen, I know you're kind of a harsh guy. You're a little bit unethical. I mean, you harvest crops that you don't plant, and, you kind of gather crops you didn't cultivate. I've seen you do some of these things, boss. I know you can be kind of harsh, and I don't want to lose any of your money, So, he understood what had been given to him belonged to his master. He says, hey, this is, I'm giving back to you what belongs to you. And I guess to his credit, I've seen plenty of Christians over, at least they kind of operate like, what they have is theirs for them to decide what to do with it, and they don't understand the idea of ownership versus manager, that we're not owners, we're managers, so maybe this guy kind of thought he could do with it as he pleased, and some of us kind of think, well, you know what? I'm not all that talented. I don't have all that much. I can't do that much. Whatever I do isn't going to make that much of a difference. If I do nothing, it won't be missed. My little bit is not going to turn things around. But the problem is that's what God's going to judge us on. That's going to be part of the judgment and the determination if we're prepared and we're ready for the coming of Jesus. Is that, have we been faithful, and have we invested our lives in ways that, God's going to be pleased with? Or are we kind of just burying, what God has given? And it's interesting that this third servant, he doesn't take blame for why he did nothing. What's his excuse for not doing anything? You're a harsh guy. It's you. It's not me. It's you. And we tend to do that. I think that's part of being foolish, is that we always looking to blame and lay blame elsewhere and not take responsibility for our own actions, or in this case, our own inactions. And sometimes we'll even blame God himself, because that's who this guy was blaming. We could even blame God ourselves. Hey, listen, God didn't give me much. I don't have much. God's allowed me to go through all these hardships. Let somebody else that doesn't have as much of a life do these things. So I think this servant just didn't really, he didn't have a proper fear maybe of his master. He didn't fear his master, but he feared risk and failure. Maybe that's a good way to put it. He didn't fear his master as much as he feared risk and failure. And, and maybe sometimes we're like that too. We risk fear and we risk failure. We don't want to try something. I've heard statements like, it's better to fail at something than succeed at nothing. Better to fail doing something than succeed at doing nothing. Yeah.
Okay, the servant, if he had at least tried to fail.
Right. Yeah. And I think in this point, I think the master probably would have been okay with that. But at least you tried, because the very thing that kind of provokes the master's anger is the lack of doing anything. It like a lukewarm church. Yeah. We're existing, but we're not, doing. I heard this like last summer. I was watching a video podcast of something, and the guy was saying, I thought this was good. Imperfect activity is always better than perfect inactivity. Imperfect activity is always better than perfect inactivity. So I said, I'd rather fail at trying than succeed at doing nothing. The man should have done something with what he had. So all right, so kind of wrapping this up in the larger context of Matthew 25, and the next parable, of course, you're familiar with, is the whole sheep and the goats thing. I think the larger point, the main point of all of this is clear. Our readiness for Jesus's return will be determined in part by the stewardship of the resources he's given us, and what we have done with the life he's trusted us, what we've done with what he has given to us. So in light of this parable and these two parables, I think we need to ask ourselves, what have we done with what God has given us, whether it be the knowledge, the brain power, the time, the money, our abilities? What have we done? Because, in some real sense, the sins of omission, the things we didn't do, may ultimately be more dangerous than the sins of commission, the things that we do. And so, if anything, these parables should at least shake us up to make sure that, are we in fact investing our lives in what God has given us and what God has entrusted to us? Because that ultimately is how we're going to be prepared for his return. Okay, so that concludes this study. As I said, for those of you that signed in late or came in late, we'll meet next week. We'll finish up this parable study next week, and then we're going to take a 2-week break, and we'll kick back off again the first Wednesday of April, and on a topic still to be still to be determined. So let's pray. God, we thank you for the challenge to be ready, to be prepared for what you have given us and for what we have done with what you have entrusted us with. God, may we all take our focus off what we do not have or what we have not been given and focus more on what you have given us and what we do have to make sure we're using what you have given us and what we do have properly and according to your will. We thank you and we give you the praise and the glory in the name of Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Amen. All right. Well, good seeing all of you again. See you all Sunday.